Hi, Gary.
Hi. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm okay. I never see you. I just hear from you, so it's a pleasure. I don't see you now either, but I will eventually. So.
It's strange.
So, what have you been hearing from your spies in Tehran?
I've heard that they're laying the foundation basically for arrest. Someone who's been watching state television over 2 days said they're making it look like it's the people who are asking the government to arrest people who are responsible for what happened in Ashura, and they're just playing footage and film to kind of stir up the emotions and kind of pave the way. So it's a very tense time.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that people will actually buy that, but I guess that's what propagandists do. Is they just tell one lie after another, and I guess if you keep piling them on, it eventually gets through to at least a few people. So.
That's the big question, exactly. Those who don't have access to the internet and satellite television, and who do rely on state television, to what extent does it actually affect them? So,
yeah. Well, I guess we will find out. They've been pretty unsuccessful so far. I've been, for me, this whole event is being extremely emotional also, because I was around 31 years ago watching from the White House, actually, when the Iranian Revolution took place. And I find so many things that are the same. It's just amazing how this regime increasingly resembles the Shah and the way he functioned and the way he acted. And I guess you saw it from a different perspective when you were in Tehran at that time, weren't you?
Yes, I was a student at Tehran American School when the revolution started, and I was there until the middle of the Iran-Iraq War, so I was there when things changed very quickly, took a U-turn, and I think it's because of the lessons of the 79 revolution that a lot of those people who are there now are afraid of another revolution, even if they were able to have something like that. So maybe we can talk about that, because the issue keeps coming up. Is this a revolution? What are some of the similarities you see, Gary, between now and then, and the differences?
Yeah, well, as I say, a lot of things just look terribly familiar to me. The way they're cracking down, they're trying to put the onus on the opposition. They're trying to pretend that everything is just fine with them and that there's really no threat. And of course, it's hard to find anybody who actually believes that they're telling the truth. But what is a revolution? People have argued about that a lot. In my view, the revolt that took place in 1978 really didn't become a revolution until like the Jala Square incident, when a lot of people were killed at one moment. And then, of course, it peaked at Ashura in December of 1978, when literally somebody said 30 to 40% of the entire population of Tehran came out in the streets and marched. Mm-hmm. And by that time, the Shah had declared martial law the month before. It really hadn't worked, and here were basically the entire population turning against him. And he was gone 6 weeks later. So, or maybe even less than that. So, in some respects, this looks very familiar. But I don't think we're there yet. I think this is still what I would call it a rebellion. And the opposition is trying to get the kind of support that it thinks it deserves, but I don't think they're quite there yet. I think you watched the events of the weekend, and you saw a few people other than students and young people. But what was your take on how the kind of support they were getting on the streets?
It's very difficult to tell, isn't it, from just the videos. The eyewitness accounts that we had, people kept referring to people from all walks of life, but I don't know if that's one representative from each. It's really, really difficult to tell, and that's why, even those who are there aren't able to make any predictions, let alone those of us kind of peering, at it through YouTube videos. But it is, it wasn't I think it was much more extensive than some Iran experts said in the beginning, that it was just the elite of North Tehran who were taking part in this. I think it's much more extensive than that, and we saw, students don't represent, the upper middle class. It's a very one of the most successful programs of the Islamic Republic has been its education, has been its higher education. So you have, children of all backgrounds who go on to universities, and as we saw, starting, as soon as the schools opened up again, the universities opened up again, there was unrest all over the country. Every time an official went to speak to them, there was unrest, and that kind of, we saw what happened on Student National Day, which was on December 7th, and we saw what happened. So it does seem to be growing, and at least it's registering. I mean, there's a lot that probably happened that we never heard about.
I think there really is. I watched a lot of video over the weekend as these clips were coming through from cell phone cameras, and every now and then you would catch a glimpse where they were actually beating up a policeman or something like that, and here would be a lady with the scarf on her head who looked like she was in her 50s, and it was clearly not what you expected. Obviously, the student age population was very well represented. I think anybody who believes that this is just a northern Tehran phenomenon they've lost touch. It just isn't that way at all. Plus the fact that there were demonstrations in Isfahan, Shiraz, even Mashhad, Tabriz, all over the place, and of course, what made it really difficult in this case was that these are, in fact, Ashura is a time when normal people go out and march in the streets. That is a normal thing to do. So it's hard to tell where the protests start and stop and where the ordinary populace starts and stops. But there were some other people there. But I just don't think they've got the kind of volume of support. I have a friend who wrote a very good book about the Iranian Revolution, and he said that it's really only in retrospect that you can look back and tell when it turned into a revolution. But he said it's really when the bulk of the people suddenly begin to believe that the opposition may win. That, in other words, they think up until that time they've mostly gone about their daily business, doing what people do, going to work in the morning, getting up, going to school, and then but they assume that the government is the government, and you do have these protesters out there, but they don't have anything to do with that. Then all of a sudden something occurs, and they say, this group may actually win, and at that point they begin to shift their allegiance. And my friend said, when that starts to happen, it's over. That is the tipping point where it turns into a full-scale revolution, and also the point when the government is doomed. That there's nothing you can do at that point as that population begins to swing away from you and off to another side. And I don't think we're there yet.
And strikes, strikes in industry seem to be a big part of a revolution, and I don't think that has happened either. And another big component is a leader. Back then they had Ayatollah Khomeini.
Yep.
And it's not clear that Mir Hossein Mousavi and Karoubi, they are the symbolic leaders, but not necessarily the leaders. This is a movement that can continue to go on, even if they were arrested.
Yeah, I think very much so. And actually, one of the clerics said today, talking about a different subject, he said, well, if you arrested Mousavi and Karoubi, it would make no difference. And he was talking to the Basij, saying, but if you beat them up, different things would happen. But I think you're absolutely correct that there's no Khomeini this time around. Of course, he was operating from a distance. And what he was doing was living first in Najaf, but then later on in Paris, and communicating with people by cassette tapes. He would record his sermons, and they would be brought in and reproduced in thousands and thousands of copies and circulated throughout the country. And that was really high tech in those days. Now what's happening is really very different. I think this is the first postmodern rebellion that we've ever seen. This is, instead of having a leader, a hierarchy of leadership going down to the people, basically everybody is part of a nervous system that is all connected by email and Twitter and Facebook and websites and cell phone cameras and text messaging and on and on and on. And it's like a nervous system, all with the different points connecting with each other. And a lot of what happens is, it seems to me, really spontaneous. Now, there may be somewhere in the background some really smart guy who is beginning to think about grand strategy, about an ideology, about what a government would look like if they should happen to win this thing and take over. At the moment, I don't think very many people are thinking about that. But if there is such a guy somewhere off in the, or girl for that matter, off in the distance who is doing some grand strategizing, it's not evident. In the revolution, you had people like Shariati and others who were making speeches and whose words were quoted by people and they got excited about it. There's no ideology to this. I mean, do you detect anything that looks like, an ideological meeting place where these people could get together?
Not at all. I think I really don't. But I agree with everything you said. One important thing, though, is that I don't think there is a leader either, and I don't think there is. I don't see anyone emerging in the near future either. But one important thing is that people like Mousavi have become much more popular than they were 6 months ago. And this is something that was echoed by someone I was just speaking to, who said that it's just, he not only has he matured himself, I think he's a very different person, but his appeal has changed. I don't think he was that charismatic, during the election, during the debates, but I think he has become so. And and when you look at the photos of him after his nephew was, according to the government, assassinated, I don't know. There was a great deal of empathy there, and I think that, but the important thing is this movement will, whatever it is, will continue with or without him.
That's a really interesting point, because actually Jean-Paul Sartre has a short story which I read many years ago, which I actually can't even find anymore, but it basically talked about a fellow who, it turned out, was an ultra right-winger, and he was attending meetings and things, but he was a nobody, and he started just making speeches and talking about his views, and people responded to it, and he was surprised. And so basically over the course of this story, the fellow turns from a nonentity into a leader, and he does that because he basically is representing their views. He's saying what they want to hear. And I would argue that Mousavi was actually forced into this position, that he didn't really go looking to be the leader of a revolt.
I totally agree.
But he has now found himself in the position where he's being pushed along by the crowd. And I think that he may, in fact, rise to the occasion. On the other hand, he's about my age, probably, and so he's not likely to be the fiery young, leader who's going to take over and run things. But neither was Khomeini. Actually, Khomeini was about my age at the time of the revolution. So you don't underestimate these old folks. It's amazing what they've got up their sleeves.
I was, Mousavi, his lackluster approach has kind of been effective so far. If he had made those fiery speeches, he would have probably been arrested by now.
Yeah.
And I think those who do follow him understand that they understand his limitations, and so they carry on without his condoning them, or without Mousavi telling them what they should be, what their slogans should be. So considering how, everyone I've spoken to agrees that Ashura has been an important turning point, and things have, kind of spiraled downward.
Yeah.
So given the current turmoil in Iran, how does that affect foreign policy? What does that mean for the United States?
Well, I assume that there are a lot of people in Washington asking that question, or maybe in Hawaii. But they actually, I suspect they don't really have an answer to it. Because on one hand, it seems to me the regime wants to pretend that everything is as before, that nothing has changed and everything is going very well. And so they would like to continue on. For instance, Ali Larijani, the Speaker of the Majlis, just went off this week for a trip to Egypt and elsewhere, carrying apparently a message saying, we really want to build bridges and cooperate with you people in the Arab world, and basically undercutting some of this tremendous fear that has built up in the Arab world about the fact that the Shia are a major threat to their existence. And I think he has, then Mubarak went off and traveled through the Gulf after that. So they are trying to actually pursue some kind of foreign policy. The other thing is that they did make a counteroffer to the United States about the nuclear business. Mm-hmm. They had originally said we could only have a swap of uranium on Iran's soil. And this week the foreign minister said, we could do it in Turkey as well. That idea had come up before. If I were Obama, I would say, okay, let's explore that. You say you can do a swap there. Fine, you will arrange it so that you take a considerable portion of your low-enriched uranium, you take it to Turkey, and it will be held there by the Turks and under the lock and key of the IAEA. And in the meantime, the Russians and the French will produce the fuel rods that go into your research reactor, which is where all of this started. And then when those are delivered, we take the uranium that was given to you that was given to the Turks. And if they're willing to accept that, basically that's just as good a deal as we were talking about at the beginning. Now, it isn't clear to me that the government in Iran, the regime, is actually capable of taking a decision like that. But if the foreign minister now is making that openly an offer, why not take him up on it? It seems to me that the idea that somehow negotiations are dead, that this is over and that we have to just forget about it is wrong. I think there's still life in that corpse, and I really think that the administration would do very well to at least explore what life is there before going on to what the Congress is proposing, which is massive sanctions. I don't know if you've been watching the sanctions bill move through the Congress.
I haven't. I've just been kind of following the headlines. It seems like such a bad idea.
I think if I sat myself down and gave myself a week to think really hard about it, I can't think of coming up with a worse idea than what they're doing. This whole idea, it's one thing. If you want to tighten the screws on the Revolutionary Guard with, say, some new bank rules or something, fine. That is just fine. If you want to stop them from traveling outside the country, identify the bad guys, and okay, that's fine. You want to put a boycott on gasoline, the Iranian people are going to be the ones that get hit by that. The Revolutionary Guard will take over the smuggling of gasoline. They'll bring it into the country. They will make a killing importing gasoline and selling it in the country. And every person that goes to a gas pump will have to pay a higher price. And they'll say, who did that? It was the Americans who did that. What can we possibly gain by that? Other than just annoying everybody and in effect persuading them that we are really the bad guys that they keep saying that we are.
And what is the logic there, that they're going to put economic pressure on middle class, on the working class, and they're in turn going to get so mad at the government, they're going to try to put more pressure on the government? This is a government that is, doesn't have to listen to them. This is not.
Yeah, well, we've seen that proved recently that they just don't care what the people are saying or what they're doing.
They haven't given in 1 inch, one
That's
centimeter,
right.
over the 6 months. And this is a rentier state that they have the means to
Put that shade down.
the money flowing in. They'll find ways to do it, and they don't care. Yeah, it's. I don't know what the logic. It just seems like a nice political thing.
Well, it's domestic politics, and basically this is supposed to make us look tough, show that we're really serious. It's supposed to get their attention, and I think it's going to have exactly the opposite effect. That it will simply show that we're not serious, and that the Iranian people then will have to decide whose side they're really on. And I think that's the kind of a decision that we would much prefer that they didn't have to go through. Anyway, I'm really depressed about that because basically this is truly bipartisan. I think the bill was written by AIPAC. It is being supported by Israel's strongest supporters in the Congress. It is getting a tremendous amount of attention, not just from the Republican side, but very much from the Democratic side. Right after they passed health care, the leader of the Senate said, "Okay, our next big piece of legislation is the Iran boycott legislation," and that was the next thing that they planned to take up in January. So that, it seems to me, is something that is going to come down, and it's going to put the president in a very tough position. If he doesn't sign the legislation, does that mean that he's not willing to get tough with Iran? If he does sign it, he's on a slippery slope leading right toward a military conflict eventually, because nobody in the rest of the world is going to join us in putting those sanctions on. Maybe the British will, but the Russians and the Chinese certainly are not. It means we have to do it ourselves, and it really means blockading Iran, inspecting ships coming into Iran, and that's an act of war. And if we do that, the Iranians for sure will retaliate, and suddenly we have taken a situation where the Iranian people are confronting their government, and we shift their attention away to a situation where they need to support their government because they're being attacked by a major foreign power. And we know what they will do in those circumstances. It is just a really terrible idea. And yet, there's the Congress of the United States, in its infinite wisdom, is now getting ready to saddle us with this problem. And there are some useful things that can be done. That is definitely not one of them.
Can this come to a stop right now? I mean, what?
Well, the thing is that if Obama really wants it to stop, I guess he can let the Congress know in no uncertain terms. I think up until now, he was so involved with the health care debate that he hesitated to offend anybody and to lose any votes or to risk losing any votes. So now that the health care thing is passed, will he take a different position and begin to talk seriously to the people in the Congress? If they write it in a broad way that gives the administration an opening, lets the administration decide what might be helpful and when, that could be useful. But if they insist that it's going to have to be a boycott of gasoline, I think that is going to put Obama in a very tough position, basically a no-win position. And I hate to see his own people doing that to him.
Who's advising the president on Iran?
Well, he's got a number of people. I think this is such a highly politicized issue. I've always felt that with the United States and Iran, it was never foreign policy. It was always domestic policy on both sides. Mm-hmm. The United States took decisions on the basis of American domestic politics, and Iranians took decisions on the basis of Iranian domestic politics. And the fact is, they never find a way to get along with each other because of those two domestic. Neither one of the two countries has the courage to stand up to the other and to stand up in front of their own people and say, this is what we need to do, and I know it's not going to be popular, but I'm going to do it anyway, and because it's for the good of the country. We have not seen any politicians with the courage to stand up and do that so far. Will this be an exception? Well, we'll see. Obama has a lot of other things on his plate. I guess something else that reminds me of 1978, 79. People look back at the Iranian Revolution and think that it was just a quick thing, which it was all done and over with, and talk about the U.S. role. The fact is, the U.S. government, for 11 months, didn't even have a meeting to ask about Iran. They had so many other things going on. Camp David was going on. There was a whole, the Panama Canal Treaty, a whole range of things, SALT negotiations with the Russians, and they just never got around to it. And it's not that they could have actually changed the course of the revolution, but the fact is, they were expecting the Iranians to deal with it themselves. Well, I think in this case, Obama has so much on his plate that the chance that he is going to really go to work on this and make this a centerpiece of his action and expend political capital to try to resolve the issue domestically remains to be seen. He's just got so many other things to do.
One other thing, how good do you think Iranians are at striking a deal maybe behind closed doors? I think there was some secret talks going on when you were in the White House between, there was, Bill Sullivan, who was the last U.S. ambassador, I think he had some pretty high-level talks with the revolutionaries. Can you tell us a little more about that?
This is something that people forget, is that when a regime gets in trouble, when they think they're really going to lose it, or they think that they're losing their support, they suddenly get very imaginative, and they're willing to try almost anything. At this stage, it's very hard to imagine the regime, the Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards, cutting a side deal of some sort with Mousavi and Karoubi, for instance, to form a government of national unity or something of that sort. Or even behind the scenes, you call off your guys and we'll call off our guys, and let's see if we can work something out. Those kinds of things you can't predict, but they are the kinds of things that governments actually think about when they actually get to that point. So it seems to me, I am aware of the fact that at the end, when the revolutionaries were really destroying everything in Iran, the regime was on the verge of collapsing, that Bill Sullivan, the U.S. ambassador, met secretly with some of the top revolutionaries who were operating in the country and began to work out a deal, strictly on his own. Unfortunately, he didn't consult Washington at the time when he was doing this, which was a little bit unfortunate, but that's what happened. In this case, it's not something that you can predict, but I think we should stay alert to the possibility that something like this really might happen, that it's conceivable that some kind of a deal could be done on the side. And it also would be a very Iranian thing to do, to use the iron fist on one side and then behind the scenes say, well, look, we're all Iranians, we can talk to each other, let's work something out here that will keep us from losing it completely, because I think at this point their main concern is that the entire revolution is at stake, that everything that they work for and everything that they've come to believe in and rely on is at risk. And that does get people's attention. I think this has gotten the attention of the people in Tehran. But again, it's hard to predict where they will come out on this.
Yeah, so far it seems to be the farthest thing from their mind.
It certainly does.
What else is there? What else?
We've covered quite a bit of territory, actually. I'm trying to think if there's a major area because I don't I don't think it's useful for us to get into speculation because what, in my experience, you speculate and you're just wrong. You're always wrong because things. It's like who would have predicted Montezeri dying in the first 3 days of Muharram? You know,
exactly.
So and then that his seventh day marker would fall on Ashura. I mean, who could have predicted such a thing? And
exactly.
yet, it had a huge impact on the politics of the country.
I don't think even the government was prepared for Ashura. I think it took everyone, all of us, even those of us who were watching it minute by minute, by surprise that it was that extent. And and just kind of looking over at how unpredictable every election has been. I mean, it's the wrong thing to do to make any predictions, but I think it's safe to say we both agree that we don't see this as a revolution just yet. I mean, that's.
Yeah, I think it really is premature to say that. Again, I'm in some respects a prisoner of my own past, but I do remember that the Iranian Revolution, which is regarded as extraordinarily fast, really the first demonstration was in January of 1978, and the Shah left in January of 1979, so it's almost exactly 12 months. We are now 6 months into this with a regime that is very strong, that is ruthless, more ruthless than the Shah. The Shah was much more restrained in what he was willing to do. And I think it's not over yet. And the regime could do a couple of things. It could, look what they're doing. I mean, over the last few days, they've apparently arrested something like 1,100 people, put them in jail. A senior relative of one of the leaders of the opposition has apparently been assassinated, basically right outside his home. This is getting really serious, and if they keep cracking down this way, they can keep the opposition off balance at a minimum. That doesn't mean that they'll win in the long run. I think every time they do one of these things, they lose a great deal of credibility and legitimacy with the people. This is, after all, that's what's really going on here.
Yes, and I'm sorry.
No, just that the legitimacy question is absolutely crucial.
And the expanding cycle of mourning ceremonies that come with every death. I mean, it's really amazing that a government that calls itself Islamic has kind of laid siege on the very foundation of what they were built on. It's it's a no-win situation.
No, well,
for them.
What's really ironic is that in 1978 in Ashura, the opposition came out and marched in vast numbers. Here we are 31 years later, and the Shah, because he was basically seen as a secular individual, did not dare to intervene or to use force. Here we have what calls itself an Islamic government. You have an Islamic holiday. People come out and march, and the protesters come out and march, and they kill them, or they throw tear gas at them, or they attack in main force against the protesters. It's a very, very different world. And that's another thing that makes it unpredictable, is that these people are not in the least restrained by the idea of Islamic tradition or niceties. They basically say, we know about Islam, and we're Islamic, and we make the rules, and we're not going to pay any attention to that. In the end, that will do them huge damage. But in the short run, it's going to be very hard for the opposition to carry out its plans.
Another big difference is that I think to someone like the Shah, a Swiss cottage or a mansion in Los Angeles may have sounded okay, but I don't think Mr. Khamenei has any of those plans, and he's not going anywhere. They're not going anywhere, so they're going to fight to the end.
Yeah, he has no place to go.
Okay. Well, I guess we should go back to following the news of what's happened over the last 50 minutes.
I'm afraid that's true. What do you think of, from your perspective? What do you think about the way the media has been covering this whole thing? I'm not sure they get it yet.
it's been a while. They thought the Green Movement was dead. They weren't covering it. Didn't mean that it was dead. I don't know. It's I feel to some extent the nuclear issue is a red herring, because I don't think anyone's really made a very convincing case that Iran is outside of, acting outside the law and what it's been doing so far, and by kind of harping on that issue over what's really going on, what the real story is, and that's like what's going on in the streets, what the changes that are happening, the shifts. I think they're missing a big story, and I don't know. It's I have my Google alerts coming through, and they all seem the same, like they're repeating the same story over and over again. I know it's very difficult for them because they don't have anyone there, but even if you do, there's limitations that now you don't have because you don't have to worry about that correspondent being there. So I like the New York Times lead that some of the things they have done to adapt themselves to the fast pace of the news that's coming out and from different sources. But,
I thought that was a really innovative breakthrough. I mean, the blog that the Times has been running, so it gives their reporters a chance to break out of the mold and cover breaking news and all running off of those video clips, which was just terrific. I thought that was really great. I thoroughly enjoyed that. And there are a few websites too. I think Enduring America makes a real effort to cover things as it goes, and they get a bit opinionated, but they do cover things very well. Anyway, there's a lot of good stuff going on. So, and you guys have been doing a lot of coverage also. So, I'll look for more coverage from you, and maybe we can talk about this again later sometime.
That sounds good. It was really nice speaking with you.
Okay, Kelly, it was great.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.